Welcome to those who are joining. We will get started in just a moment, and feel free to introduce yourselves in the webinar chat. We would love to know who's here and where you're joining us from. So take a minute and do that, and we'll get started in just a moment. All right, welcome. It's wonderful to see the audience. Thank you for adding your names and where you're coming from. It's great to see such a nice turnout today. Let's get started. I am Julie Curtis with Pressbooks. I'm the Vice President of Growth and Strategy, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar. The topic today is mapping your OER journey, charting progress, navigating challenges, and building impact. So thank you for joining us today. We're excited to see a warm response to this topic. We are joined today by three phenomenal panelists, and let me invite them to make themselves known on the Zoom chat. And here there's a slide with their photos as well. So today our panelists are Abby Elder of Iowa State University, Ariana Santiago of the University of Houston, and Jonathan Lashley from the Idaho State Board of Education. So these are probably some familiar names and faces to many of you who are engaged in open education work, and I will ask them to introduce themselves shortly. And yeah, thank you for the shout outs for the phenomenal panel. Okay, as we get started, just a quick housekeeping thing. So feel free to use the Zoom chat. Again, introducing yourselves is great, and sharing comments and questions. We want to use the Zoom chat for things that you want to direct to the whole audience, so attendees as well as panelists. We know that this is an audience that likes a lively Zoom comment conversation, and we want to encourage that. If you have specific questions you would like to direct to the panelists, though, we would love to have you use the Zoom Q&A feature so that we can make sure we're not missing questions that are directed to the panel specifically. So please take that into account as you are engaging. All right, in thinking about how to start this conversation, we thought a little bit of perspective would be helpful. So this is a timeline that puts the lifespan of open education as we know it into some perspective. With a few exceptions, today's most mature and seasoned open education initiatives are still just adolescents when we think about human years. You know, they maybe are 10, 11, 12 years old. I've occasionally thought about, like, in the open education world, you know how like a dog year is 7 human years. I've wondered, like, what is one open education year in terms of human years? And I don't know, maybe that's a topic for another conversation. But as virtually anyone involved in this work will tell you, we are still figuring it out. We're sharing ideas, we're learning from those who are ahead of us or alongside us in the OER journey. And we're only now arriving at a point where the notion of a maturity model even makes sense, because we're only now starting to see a critical mass of open education initiatives that have survived and evolved long enough to be able to describe them as mature. And so this is a point where thinking about a maturity model for open education could make sense. So a maturity model is a framework that helps us recognize patterns in how organizations or projects or teams grow, how they develop. Maturity models are planning tools that can help us understand and navigate and anticipate, where are we, where is change coming, where will growth come from, what does that look like? So over the past several years, Pressbooks has worked with hundreds of organizations to support a variety of different open education initiatives at all different levels of development. And so, informed by this work, Actually, let me mark out of that notification. So informed by this work that we've done, we've developed an applied model, a maturity model for open education initiatives. So it uses a standard 5-stage structure, and I'll take just a moment and kind of dash through the stages. So the stage 1 is about getting started. It's about discovering, dabbling, building awareness. It's an organization that's figuring out what is open education, how does it work. There tends to be little formalized institutional support other than a green light to say, hey, let's learn, let's try things out. In stage 2, a building believer stage, this is about finding a coalition of the willing, a coalition of the curious. This is where advocates start to emerge and identify allies and partners in this work. So there's a lot of experimentation that tends to happen in this stage. Organizations are exploring what directions might make sense. Is it, what is it that our community is looking for? Is it about creating new OER? Is it about finding and adapting and adopting what exists already? Is it about engaging students with open pedagogy? Is it, a variety of different directions this could take? This is also an important stage to be thinking about how do the things that open education can do align with the organization's strategic priorities, to build that alignment, because that's important for the will to take things further. As we look at stage 3, this is where you've arrived there when you figured out a direction that you want to take your initiative. So this is about defining some goals, setting a course, and then importantly, it's about creating some organizational and technical support for the change that you want to create. So it's building a foundation with some ends in mind. Stage 4 is about leveraging that foundation. It's about taking what you've created so far and kind of proving it out, showing the value of the investments that you're making in people and processes and tools and so forth. And then with success also comes a question of like, what are we going to do? How are we going to go forward? And also, are there things that we're not going to do? Are there things that we say no to or we limit in order to protect the things that we've built so far? And then stage 5 is around optimizing impact. So this is about sustaining, it's making a systemic and productive part of organizational priorities and planning. It's really building that deeper well of support and making open education just a part of what you do and how you operate. This is also an important time to reflect and say, how are we recognizing the impact? What are the things that we're seeing? What are the ripple effects that are happening, and where can we improve? This is also a where next stage that might find you, so we have here kind of looping back cyclically to say, where are we going to go next? And is there something different or new that we want to do with our foundation building in order to achieve the next thing, the next horizon that we're going to go after? So I know there's a lot to absorb here, and we have a panel to dig in deeper. But before we ask the panel to jump in, we want to invite an audience poll. So take a moment to consider your open education initiative and where you're where you're at along this model. So where would you place yourself? You should have a Zoom chat question coming up here in a minute. And so I'll pause, and I'm very curious to see where our audience is on the scope of our maturity model. All right. It looks like we've got folks all over across the model, which is amazing. So fabulous. And then, yeah, and some people saying, yes, we're starting over after we got up to phase 5. That's awesome too. Before we go, panelists, do you want to comment on the poll results? Any thoughts? All right, we'll keep going. We have one more question that we would like the audience to respond to. This time we'd like to have you respond in the chat. So what is the top challenge or growing pain that you're experiencing today with your open education initiative? And I'm going to pause here and peruse responses as they're coming in. So funding and budget seems to be a big one. Staff time, workload. that resource availability, awareness, communication. Stage 3 is tricky. Yes, that is a true comment. Getting faculty on board, research, expansion, and sustainability. All right. Technology, infrastructure, energy, and finding time to do the work. All right, panelists, I know that you'll be kind of looping back to some of this. Any comments on that before we dive in and turn things over to you? All right. Thank you. Keep those comments coming. So let's hear from our panel. Each of our panelists has demonstrated remarkable creativity and leadership in their open education work. So I will let them share more about the context that they bring to this conversation. So we're going to start out by asking this question. So briefly introduce yourself and the OER initiatives you lead, and also tell us, where would you place yourself and your work on this maturity model today and why? So let's do Abby and then Ariana and then Jonathan, if you don't mind going in that order.
Yeah, we're going alphabetical order by first name. Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Elder. I am the Open Access and Scholarly Communication Librarian for Iowa State University, where I lead our open education program. And I'm also the statewide open education coordinator for Iowa, through which I work with an action team made up of volunteers to help institutions across our state grow their own OER programs. So since I have two programs, I guess I also have two numbers here. At Iowa State University, I'd say we're like a 5.3. We're in that middle space, as a lot of you said you were, where we have some well-established publishing programs, grants, and other services available. But as we're expanding on those services, we need to keep assessing what we're doing, what we want to keep doing, and what we prioritize. Across Iowa, though, we're sort of at a 2 or a 3. We have some colleges doing amazing work with Z-degree programs and faculty adoptions, but others are still struggling to say they can support OER, and we want to build awareness and support and sort of infrastructure to help people get started. So it's really across the range of folks, and I'm excited to see what everyone else is working on their programs.
Thank you, Abby.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ariana Santiago. I'm the head of Open Education Services at the University of Houston Libraries. And when I first saw this maturity model, I think the level 4 advancing objectives stage really resonated with me the most, especially those questions that are asked of what will we be assessing beyond cost savings, who leads what do we do and what do we not do? I've been very much in that headspace lately, though I'd also say both the 3 and the 5 stage resonated with me as well, because we're constantly reflecting and trying to improve. And I think we're kind of in a place where we're making some we're able to expand or enhance our support a little bit and then go back and kind of recalibrate and ask those questions again of what do we do, what do we not do, and kind of redefining what we do and the infrastructure that's needed as well, if that kind of makes sense. So I really see that cycle from 3, 4, and 5 kind of going back and forth there in that in those areas.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan Lashley. I'm the Academic Technology Program Manager for the Idaho State Board of Education. And in Idaho, at the state level, we consider open education and all related practices to be under the banner of academic technology. So part of my work is coordinating statewide initiatives with our 4 community colleges and 4 universities, but also our state board coordinates K-12 as well as post-secondary education. So there's, true to Kathy's comment in the chat, there's no shortage of work and discussions to be had about K through 20 and lifelong learning as it relates to open ed in Idaho. But also for the last 7 years, I've been an active participant and co-leader of a community of practice between our institutions. It's a group of open practitioners, advocates, and leaders. We affectionately refer to ourselves as OPAL because we live in the GEM state. And because of that work, largely that stem from the grassroots, Looking at the model, I really feel like we occupy a similar place to what Ariana describes, in between 3, 4, and 5, in that sort of reflect and evolve feedback loop, which is great because I think it also indicates that this is a active framework. It's a dynamic framework, that just because you reach stage 5 in some respects doesn't mean that you did it. You've accomplished open education. And therefore we need to keep interrogating and trying to find ways to improve. And so thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for those introductions. I'm going to switch out of screen sharing mode so that we can see the people more than the slide, I guess, and dig into some questions for the panel. So my first question, considering the progression represented in the maturity model, in your experience, what's a top challenge or a growing pain, and what helped you through it? I'm not sure who would like to start out to lead out with that. Ariana, do you mind? Oh, Jonathan, if you're ready, go ahead.
I was going to jump in because you recognized one of my comments in the chat about stage 3. And I think that stage 3 is always going to be something that we have to contend with in our open education work in Idaho, largely because when it comes to formalizing foundations, our most valuable foundation is the people who are actively involved in conversations around open education. And that means naturally our foundation is firm, but always shaky. And especially in recent years in a state like Idaho, there's been a lot of outside pressures, everything from turnover, which we all know is disruptive, to political factors and emergent threats to the work that we do. And so what has been helpful, however, is when you build initiatives around the people involved and you right size them to be appropriate to the responsibilities and the needs of those individuals who are involved. There's also ways to build things like shared affinity, collaboration, agency, and safety and security in ways that empower people to take the reins and take leadership when they need to. And the best example I have of this actually is I left my state level work in Idaho for about 11 months. And during that time, I also sort of left this community of practice that's been running since 2017, early 2017. And not only did I come back to a group that was just as active as ever, but it was being led out by new people. The conversation had shifted around the needs that most represented the group who was attending at the time. And to me, that's a sign of people who feel safe and secure and empowered in the work that they do. And I think with that, it helps us get through any number of hardships.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to build off of some of what Jonathan said, specifically in relation to stage 3 being something to contend with. So in response to the question, one of my top challenges has been workload and having limited capacity. And it sounds like that's something that's very relatable with some of the comments we've seen in the chat. Especially thinking about those first few stages where early on in our initiatives, we're very often in the position of, doing more and more outreach, trying to increase engagement, awareness, reach more people, increase adoptions, kind of this do more, reach more people outlook, which is great because that's really important to be able to reach more people and build believers. But I found that shifting from that mindset into kind of that stage 3 part of that maturity model, I found there to be kind of like a tipping point where that push to do more really came up against the limited capacity to do more or even maintain what we were already doing. Yeah, so that is very challenging. And I found myself in a place where I felt kind of stuck, though we were doing a lot of great things. I didn't feel like I had like the time or space to try something new or explore new ideas or do anything differently on top of what we were already doing. And one example of that is open pedagogy, for example. For the longest time, I thought, yeah, that sounds fantastic. I would it would be great in an ideal world to work with our faculty on open pedagogy, but I couldn't even think about what that would look like, to where, I wasn't even really discussing that with our faculty, because I was also worried about workload in terms of, well, if I start talking to our faculty about open pedagogy, I want them to have support for that. And I know I don't have the bandwidth to do that right now. What helped me work through this challenge, I would say two things. One is advocating for more resources. And I'm fortunate that we have been able to expand our capacity. And I mentioned earlier, I'm the head of Open Education Services at UH Libraries. That's a relatively new department that was formed a little over a year ago. We have another OER librarian, right? So we have expanded our capacity, and that's great. But the advocating for those resources is a really important part of that, and having other leaders on board with me so I wasn't advocating alone is something that really helped with that as well. But in the absence of, being able to actually gain more resources, something else that has helped me with this workload and capacity challenge is setting those limits of what I can and can't do, or at least articulating that to the best of my ability, and being able to say, like, here's where I am. And I, for example, can't explore open pedagogy right now because I'm at my limit. Another example of kind of articulating the scope of support would be, for example, in offering Pressbooks, I'm pretty upfront with our faculty about, we provide this platform, I could talk to you about it, provide some introductory training and troubleshooting, but we don't go in and enter and format their content for them. That's on them, because that's our limit. It's not what we can offer right now, and that's still the case today. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ariana. I'll do one really quick answer to this question. So, thinking about a challenge that we've experienced and what helped us through it, we've sort of talked about external pressures. You've talked a little bit about the issue of the limits of people power that you actually have. And a lot of people in the chat were also talking about earlier the issue of visibility and awareness on your campus. And I think one of the biggest problems we encountered early on here was, if you build it, well, it doesn't matter if you build a service, if you build something useful for people, if they don't know it exists. People may not come and use those services if you're not doing a good job at actually marketing them and communicating them to people. So one issue we had is we started up OER consultations, helping people locate, align, and put materials into their courses, but faculty weren't actually utilizing those services here. So how we found a way around it was by leveraging those existing models and services at our institution that were helping people think about redoing their courses already. So now we have an explicit referral process with our Center for Learning and Teaching, where if a faculty member comes and says, I want to redesign my course, I want to think about building out a new course, then they'll be able to talk to them right away and say, have you considered OER? Have you talked to the library? Things like that can come up a lot of the time, and it may not be an issue of I need to build a marketing campaign. You might just need to have ins with other people on campus who can talk to the audiences you want to reach. And there's awesome talk happening in the chat right now that I also want to follow up with, but we'll get to that a little bit later.
Thank you. We have some good questions coming in. I want to ask a panel question that I think is a good precursor to the question that Amy Hofer posed. So let me ask this panel question first, and then it will lead in, I think, nicely to Amy's question. So what aspect of your OER initiative did you focus on building out first, and why? That's a starting point. And then Amy's question will be a follow-on around when you start adding things, and that loops you back to an earlier stage. But we do have some early stage people, so I think it's beneficial to hear, where did you start and why?
I can start again. So for us, and to just, I think, undergird where this conversation really formalized and started in Idaho, was through casual, open, organic conversation between practitioners across campuses. It really was grassroots. We didn't have a charge from executive leadership. We didn't have an executive sponsor per se. What we had, myself and others, was a firm interest in the open education movement. and in open educational practices, and how that was influencing not only our work, but also our research and the lives of our students. And we wanted to get better at sharing that with others. In 2017, I came to Boise State, and open education was already a conversation among a number of groups on campus when I got there. But importantly, that conversation was sort of fractured. The library had its personnel who were interested. Online learning had its personnel, IT, which I was serving in, and I was also faculty. We had our groups. And so the important thing was making connections not only interdepartmentally, but then we found out interinstitutionally, because I was presenting at Washington State, which is right down the street from the University of Idaho, and I ran some librarians who were like, we know Boise State's working on open ed. We see it on the website in a variety of different pages, and we have no idea who to contact and what you all are doing. And at the time, it was novel that we had Zoom, now, which is now a mainstay, and we're all sick of it. But at the time, it was great because we could jump in really casually on a regular day every week and just touch base and say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is where we're struggling. This is what we're curious about, and opened up a conversation that way between institutions. And now it's grown to be broadly, reflective of different stakeholders and different institutions in our state. And we've had some other folks participate as well. But that's a long prefix to really saying that where we started was developing a shared language and shared convictions around what we wanted to see this work be and become. And part of that was in effort to really bolster our efforts in building awareness and advocating for ourselves, because to the points we've already discussed around labor and workload at the time, I don't think any of us, at least at Boise State, who were active in the conversation, had open education or OER anywhere formally in our job titles, let alone our job descriptions. This was another duty, a self-assigned, if you will, or a passion project, or a service obligation that we had self-assigned ourselves. And so we felt it was really necessary to make sure that if we were putting forward definitions, if we were putting forward standards, that we all agreed and we all felt like they weren't constraining our efforts, but instead, again, setting the sort of discursive foundation that we could take and share with others and hopefully bring in more people to this conversation. So that's really where we started, is trying to figure out not only what are those common standards and goals and terms that we would use, but then when we did get noticed by executive leadership, and in particular by our State Board of Education, who writes policies that effectively have the force and effect of law, we were not only subject matter experts on developing that policy, but many of us were active in co-writing policies related to our work in academic freedom, in open resources, and affordability initiatives across the state.
Thank you. Abby, do you want to go next?
Yeah, that was so much. Oh my gosh, Jonathan. So I guess I'm gonna say something much shorter in terms of what did we focus on building out first. I think what's important to think about with institutional initiatives when you don't have funding, you don't have buy-in, you're just starting out and getting this going, is what do you lack? And what we lacked when we were first starting out was any awareness of what OER is, how it can be used in courses, or even what was happening on our campus. So who is using OER right now? So the first thing we built out was workshops and professional development series, thinking about building out a panel of faculty that are currently using OER, both to get in touch with them and to feature and highlight their work. Building out a series of OER 101 workshops to get people interested in what is this, how can it be used, and how can I implement it in my courses. And then from there, we built a base of people who care about and understand this work, who could be our foundation for moving forward and doing more interesting things later. So it doesn't have to be grants or staffing or big work that you start out with. When you're just getting your initiative off the ground, sometimes just saying, hey, do you wonder what OER is? Here's our definition. Here's an explanation, and here's what you might be able to do with it in your courses. I think that's a great way to just get some groundwork laid before moving further.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. Ours panned out a little bit differently in terms of what we built out first. So the first aspect of our program that was built out was essentially our incentive program, or, similar to grant programs that other institutions have. And for some brief background on what led up to that, it was initially very student driven, where our Student Government Association learned about OER on their own, related to their concerns about textbook affordability. And they brought that to the provost and got her support for an OER initiative on our campus. And then the provost brought that to the dean of the libraries to lead. So at that point, a committee was put together of faculty and librarians and SGA representatives. And they did a lot of that research that led to forming our incentive program. So they did do some workshops, some focus groups, learned about perceptions on our campus, and learned from other institutions that had OER programs at the time. And so that's what led to them developing our incentive program, which we call the Alternative Textbook Incentive Program, seeing that that sort of thing was an established and effective practice for increasing adoptions. And because we had funding from the provost for that first year of our program, and then later that funding shifted to the library. So we were set up to be able to put together something like that. So that's the first thing that was built out. Though I will say I wasn't on that committee, and I stepped into my OER role, which at the time was OER coordinator, kind of once that was launched, and they were already getting actually already selecting faculty awardees for that program, and then I came on board. So my second part of this answer is the first aspect that I built up once I was involved, which would be definitely my knowledge and understanding around OER, because I was stepping into this program that kind of was already put together, and we were already had already built awareness. There was kind of an outreach push from administration. So the ball was already rolling, and then I kind of had to catch up. So I built up my own understanding of the faculty perspective and how they engage with and adopt OER, and what their needs are and what their questions were. And really just building up my own knowledge so that I could support the people that were already engaged with OER and planning to adopt in the coming months. And my focus in terms of building up my own experience was understanding their needs and the support they needed, so I could match them with resources and support, and think about what support or services could be provided from the libraries, primarily myself at the time.
Thank you.
So kind of backwards from what Abby's was a little bit, maybe.
No, that's great. And that element of investing in yourself and your knowledge, I think that's part of that self-care and investment for leaders and for people who are asked to step in and help lead and support this work. I'd love to then add the layer that Amy Hofer brings in her question. So she's asking about, so if you have a program in place, you may get pretty good at something, and then you add a new thing and find yourself, at least for that element, looped back to an earlier stage. We talked a little bit about this in our coordination call. So thoughts from the panel on that dynamic of, I guess it's kind of the spinning plates dynamic, right? With plates spinning at different speeds and sizes and so forth. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump in, I guess, and say we're experiencing that right now, or have been in about the past year or so with open pedagogy. And I mentioned earlier that, for a long time, I just didn't have the capacity to really engage with open pedagogy or encourage it at our institution. And, we have since expanded our capacity. And, it was maybe like fortuitous, like timing, with having an additional OER librarian, which has been fantastic, but also at around that same time, having faculty who came to me with an interest in engaging with open pedagogy. So it's kind of been a learning journey over the past year and a half. So we have been very intentional about thinking about, well, what does our support look like for open pedagogy? And I think in this case, it's also not complicated, but it's complex because of the fact that open pedagogy assignments can take so many different forms. So it's even more important and a little bit more difficult, I think, sometimes to articulate, well, what is our capacity to support this, and what do we do and what do we not do, right? Like those questions again. I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. I just wanted to say that we are experiencing this right now. And I liked what you said about kind of like spinning plates or having things in different stages, because we have some aspects of our program, like our incentive program, that are very established and run pretty well. We're always evaluating for improvement as well, but we can kind of say, okay, this is running and we're going to focus more attention over here to try to figure this out. And also be figuring out how they all work together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, going back to what I was talking about with building a shared language, once we had that secured, it was helpful for having interinstitutional, interdepartmental, cross-functional conversations about open pedagogy, open practice, OER, open textbooks, and so on. It was also helpful to identify for faculty and other practitioners on campus where their existing practice may have already aligned with open educational practice, or could be a good progenitor, or they were actively already using OER or something similar to OER, and maybe they didn't know it, maybe they were reticent to recognize it because of the abstraction of the language attached with the movement. I think the difficulty there, and this is where we've continued to mature and then reassess and right size, is in the area of awareness building and faculty learning. So when I moved to the state, one of the first things that was given to me was we got one-time funding to support open educational resource material development between institutions for general education courses. What was nice is the legislature knew enough to know that we should maybe target high impact courses. These courses were they had common course indexing across institutions, and so English 101 at Boise State would have direct transferability with English 101 at any other campus. And so that made sense. The trouble is we had $50,000 in about 6 months to spend it. And so what that meant was making educated guess about, one, knowing that we didn't have much financial incentive to get faculty to participate. How are we going to cast a broad net to find interest? And how are we going to empower them to build resources that are inevitably useful? Maybe they're not whole cloth open textbooks as alternatives to textbooks, but build resources that they can use, that they can prototype, that they can test and experiment with their students in adopting, and ultimately share out to benefit other faculty. And what we found, this, if you were wondering, got this funding in 2020, launched the program in February of 2020, and then the world shut down like immediately after. And I thought, well, this was a professional learning initiative that was going to die. But instead, instead the case is that faculty of that program banded together, they found common cause, they found, and it wasn't just the same faculty from the same courses necessarily, but math faculty were talking about assessment practices with language faculty, and they were learning from one another. And so not only did we have this common language, but we also had a model that started emerging, adapting around what does engagement look like. So fast forward, they create artifacts, they create practices, they start modeling this behavior for their students and for their fellow colleagues. And instead, what we had as part of this shift in sort of design is we actually had tangible examples of what open pedagogy looked like, of what open practice looked like, of what open educational resources looked like that were useful and relevant to Idaho specifically. And so we could pair those with the language that we were already associating. And what that means now is we have a bunch of disparate collections of resources here and there. And that leads to a whole new problem of like, how do we now, after the fact, curate this collection? It's something we're actively tackling. And what's great is what's old is new again. We have more capacity than we did 6 years ago when we were talking about building a referatory or some sort of curation of Idaho-specific resources. But that mainstay of at least having that common core material values language to buoy us through means that, just because we had a good idea at one point that's not going to work then doesn't mean we can't come back to it at some other time. And it reminds me of this concept that Amy Collier and her collaborator, I'm blanking on her name, Ross, I believe was the last name. They came up with this concept of not yetness. And it's the idea that just because you're seeing emerging trends in one area, it requires experimentation, it requires right sizing, and sometimes it requires time. But just because something is not yet viable doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing, or at least holding on to and coming back to when you have more resources.
All right, thank you. I'm pausing if there's anybody else that wants to jump in. Why don't we, all right, reading the body language on, on Zoom. Let's see, so many good questions. Actually, this one is a timely one because I think it speaks to some of the themes that we're seeing. How do you balance the human elements of the project? There are different motivations, pressures, constraints that are impacting people and work. And in the end, this is about people and the things that they do, creating motivation, creating supports. I don't know if there's maybe sort of a dotted line a connection to Eric's question about is anybody seeing kind of a diminished kind of cultural interest in OER? But again, this is about people and motivation and support. So Abby, do you want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways this question sort of comes out, whether it's with the people that you're working with or the people in your program who are supporting OER or the people you're supporting who are doing this work. When it comes to the people who are actually in your program, I think about this a lot because I'm a department of one. And as a person who's a department of one, I often have to remind myself that I'm a person and I have limited hours in the day to do things. But I find it helps to always keep in mind that the open education movement is sort of built on that foundation of remix, revise, redistribute. We do not have to come up with the coolest new marketing campaign ourselves. We don't have to come up with a service that no one else has come up with before. We can adapt what other people have done, and we can borrow those things that people have already done and reuse them in our own contexts. So when we're thinking about, oh, I have to start a new initiative, I have to start a new program, I have to do a grant, we ask and we can say, hey, what's your rubric? What's your process? What's your process for getting in touch with people? Who does your review process and actually make sure that money gets out? What are the pain points you've hit in your program? And asking is a great way to make sure that we're avoiding the horrible things that other people have had happen to them in their own programs. Sort of inversely, thinking about the humans that are doing the work of going out and teaching with OER, that are doing open pedagogy for the first time and running into, oh my gosh, this is a lot of teaching that I'm doing that I'm not used to. It's good to just keep in mind that there's going to be some hiccups along the way, and letting people know that. Because even if someone was just changing one textbook to another, even if they were just saying, oh, well, I'm going to move from this thing I've been teaching with for 20 years to a different commercial material, there's still going to be hiccups, and that's normal, and it's okay. So part of this process is just recognizing that that's part of it and talking to people through it as if it's a normal thing, because OER is not some band-aid that is just going to fix the education situation that we are in. It's not going to make higher education equitable for everyone, but it is something that is a change that can have positive effects. That was a lot of things I just said, so feel free to expand in other ways, folks.
Yeah, if I can just briefly springboard off of that, I think it's important to be respectful and mindful of existing practice, especially existing practice that even if empirically you don't know that it's effective, if it feels effective for the people in a learning environment, then it's worth learning about and adopting a sort of inquiry mindset. When I first moved to the state board office, there was a draft of a policy that I think was written under the best intentions because it was supposed to bolster open educational resource adoption specifically. The trouble was it really vaulted OER as an exemplar practice, that an arbitrary number of sections of particular types of courses needed to adopt by an arbitrary date. And the trouble with that was, and I think rightfully so, the faculty response was, well, why is OER so special when I'm already addressing the affordability needs, the accessibility needs, and the engagement needs of my students in these unique ways. And what was helpful about that crisis of policy is that we started finding out, because I made myself open to these conversations with faculty about the myriad interesting, really engaging practices that they were already pursuing in their classes. They just weren't telling anyone about it. And sometimes for good reason. One of the best ways to ensure that you have academic freedom to teach the class you want to teach and reach the goals that you have for your students and for your classroom environment is to not tell anyone about it, because otherwise you're inviting scrutiny, you're inviting oversight, you're inviting potentially some finger wagging. And instead, we really need to focus on having more generative conversations about not only what is possible with the resources and constraints that we have, but also what is desirable. And I think that's what has, I mentioned that this conversation we've had is largely practitioner driven, but what's helpful about that is that it's in practice that we determine what we really value, what we care about, what our goals are for a high quality education or engaged learning opportunities in Idaho. And the more that we lead with that, the more we can navigate as a group any sort of disruption as it relates to AI or other emerging technology. It's more effective for us to manage change because we perceive it within a continuum of effective practice and experimentation instead of, yet again, another obligation, another requirement, another standard that's being foisted on us.
Yeah, I could co-sign everything that's been said. I also want to jump off of something that's I think Amanda said in the chat about encouraging folks to start small with open pedagogy. It doesn't have to be your whole course being redesigned. It could be a small assignment. I completely agree with that. And I would say the same when it comes to adopting OER. It doesn't necessarily it's great when you can make it a zero cost course by using OER, but that's not always possible. But these are still resources that are there for folks to explore and use if it's beneficial to them and their students, right? So that start small, or maybe it's not just a start. Maybe that's where you are. It's not going to lead to completely redesigning your course. That's okay. Oh gosh, so much great stuff was said already. I would also say just in general, kind of being flexible to the extent that we can, and understanding that people have different pressures in their lives, and their engagement with open education is one piece of what they do and will be interconnected to so many other things that they do, right? So understanding that part of it. And part of what I'm thinking about as well is, for example, working with faculty in our incentive program. They are on a specific timeline that they've agreed to at the outset to adopt the resources that they're planning to use in their course. But if something comes up, something comes up in their life that's going to throw that schedule off, or they're having a hard time, being understanding of that is always the approach that I want to take. As well as being understanding of various motivations around why people may not be interested in adopting with or engaging with open educational resources or open education. I try to assume that, if someone's kind of adverse to the idea or skeptical, I'm going to assume they have a good reason for that, right? Rather than necessarily responding in a way that I'm going to convince them otherwise. Certainly, I want to inform and share information and resources, but people have valid reasons. And I understand that. And I know I'm getting a little bit long on my response here, but I'll add one more thing that I think relates to this question. There's a phrase, clear is kind. So I think setting clear expectations from the beginning is going to help people with those various pressures, motivations, etc., and just make everything clear from the beginning what's expected of people of all parties in a collaboration in providing that information. I can expand on that a little bit. I think it might relate to some of the questions in the Q&A as well.
Actually, some of the things that you've said speak to the Q&A, the question that Melissa posted around quality and how do what are things that we can do that it's not just about creating content, but making sure that there is quality there. And so she asks, what are you doing around authoring or design partnerships rather than just stipending faculty and hope that they'll deliver a product that has quality, employee reviews, so forth. So Abby, you want to jump in? I guess I don't need to read the question. So yeah.
Yes, I'll read it a little bit for the sake of those who watch the recording. So I especially like how this starts off with there seems to be an implicit assumption about OER generation that faculty are solely at the center of creating it, and faculty are not necessarily trained in pedagogy and pedagogical design and instructional design. So that is a very important question here of how do you support instructors in making good OER and implementing them well in their courses? It's not easy. There's actually a couple of different ways I might answer this question. The first being a shitty first draft is still a first draft that exists in the wild and can be improved upon. There, by having some OER that exists, we can tell faculty, hey, there are things out there that can be adapted and improved later on, and you don't have to start from scratch. That is still valuable and useful, especially in a world that's built on remixing and adapting the work of others. However, there's also a really important thing to keep in mind for those of us who have more established programs, who have support in place, and can build better content. So here at Iowa State University, we have a pretty well-established publishing program. So we've built into our process an onboarding document where faculty get training on developing teaching materials because it's not necessarily it's not necessarily natural to them how to make a textbook, especially. They're used to writing scholarly materials and research materials that are at much higher level than their students are used to reading. So talking to them about how do you make something readable, how do you make something understandable to your audience, how do you build in and align them to the learning objectives in your course are all things we go over with them. We've partnered directly with our Center for Learning and Teaching and instructional designers to make sure that they're working with faculty as well and they understand what they're doing. And as part of that, we also have those instructors sort of fast-tracked into our Quality Matters review process so they can get acknowledgement for their course's use of OER and how it's integrated into their teaching. So building out an infrastructure around supporting the use and creation of OER is one of those steps, but it doesn't have to be that intense as well. I think open textbooks especially, people like to say, well, this needs to be as good as it can possibly be. These should all look like OpenStax textbooks. But OER can be any sort of teaching material that's openly licensed, and if you can find a set of quiz questions and a set of lesson plans that you can adapt for your teaching, that's still better, even if they're just okay, than not having anything at all. And yes, Cheryl, our guide for authors is not explicitly openly licensed. It's not on there, but you can reuse it.
Yeah, Abby, I think phrased it all really well. Don't discount the value of Remix. Remix is everything. And we've had regular conversations in our state that though sure, a fully open course or OER-based course is great, and we recognize it in a variety of ways, but we also are willing to recognize those faculty who are willing to work with their students on developing resources, on using some resources, on sharing assignments that they think are effective to them openly. And what's nice about that standard is it allows our faculty and our instructional designers and our librarians to have more robust conversations about what's possible in education in general, not just in open education specifically.
Yeah, and this question about the quality of OER is exactly what I was thinking of when I started talking about like setting clear expectations up front. So yeah, we've definitely run into this. You know, our incentive program was put out there, launched, and we said you can get awarded for creating OER. And that was before all of the support was built out for that. So we have seen, you know, variations in quality of some of the things that were created over time. And so it's been a journey of kind of thinking about like, okay, how can we better support the creation process, right? What are the needs? What is within our scope? All of those kinds of questions. So one way that we are now actively working to set those expectations is we created, we're calling it a quality checklist for creating OER, and it's a pretty lightweight checklist, I think, but it has several categories. For example, open licensing, and we ask, is an open license applied? We're not stipulating which open license, but we need to make sure that you have applied an open license, and there's no misunderstanding about that when you're being, funded to create an open educational resource. So that's just one example. We also have questions that are meant to review certain aspects of the material, like if you've adapted other OER, are those properly attributed? And we can help you do that if you're not sure how to do it. We have questions about accessibility, those sorts of things. So we're just now getting to the point where we're able to actively implement this and say, for these faculty that we're going to be awarding and supporting in our program, here's this list that is going to be beneficial to you throughout the process. And we've incorporated links to other resources so they can, hopefully go and explore and learn about it. And, we say, come talk to us if you have questions about any of these things, and we'll be checking in with them as well. But so that's kind of the building it, the creating what those expectations are. Like, well, what are we going to stipulate that we need to see, and what's our capacity for ensuring that that's the case, when they say, okay, I'm done, and we take a look at it as well and say, well, you may want to look at X, Y, and Z and go make some revisions, right? So those are all newer practices that we're really working on enforcing as well.
Yeah, if I may really quickly just emphasize the value of remixing administrative practice and procedure, because whether it's the institutions in our state who have made OER consideration or open material searching part of the online course development process, or librarians who are paired with specific disciplines or subject matters at our institutions who are looking through and seeing, are they using e-texts that are commercial textbooks, but we could divert funds that are otherwise going to unused subscriptions to pay for that, so that there's no new cost to students as an alternative to a truly open solution. Again, it's not just remixing materials, but it's remixing the practices that we already have in existence at our institutions.
Thank you. We are almost at time, excuse me. And there's, a half dozen more questions that I would love to dig into. So I'm going to jump to a final question, because I think by the time we get it answered, it'll be time for us to wrap up. This is a question, though, that I'm going to put to the panel, but I'm also going to post it in the chat, because we're interested in having everyone share. So this question is, looking back on how you've matured in this work, what is one thing you wish you had known when you started? So I will post that in the chat, but would love for the panelists to give that a little bit of thought. And we invite the broader audience interested in seeing what others share as well on that. Let's see. Ariana, can we start with you?
Oh no, sorry, I'm terrible at this question. So something I wish I had known from the start. I'll probably think of a better answer later. But I think what I wish I had known was the community in open education being so rich and supportive. And that's coming from me, coming into OER from a different subfield of academic librarianship, and knowing that I would be leaving that established network kind of behind, not necessarily entirely, but taking a shift, So I was a little bit nervous about kind of restarting that community, but it's been fantastic. So that's something that I wish I had known, and it had kind of more reassurance and less hesitance around it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks. Jonathan?
It's interesting reflecting back, at least the last 7 years in Idaho specifically, because I had been an educator who had used open educational resources. I'd been an administrator who had designed programs on open educational resources before coming to Idaho. But I was still early enough in my career that I think I also discounted my capacity to show up authentically, and that would not only be enough, but that would be satisfactory to helping lead or at least maintain or sponsor momentum around this work. And so I wish I would have known more about myself and my own sort of inherent interests and ways of being vital to this work. For me personally, I moved around a lot growing up, and so I was very accustomed to being the new kid and being unapologetic in reaching out to people who I thought were doing interesting work or just wanting to know what other people were doing. And I truly believe that that was so much of what has been helpful for me in building relationships and connections, not only within our state, but outside of our state. And I think that's so vital to this work. You can't really exist in a vacuum and do this work sustainably. You'll get burnout or worse. And so I would say, my lesson learned is to have faith in yourself and in your convictions, to make connections, to find help, to ask for help, to set boundaries, because this is a really beautiful community in general, is what I found. And they're broadly supportive and human-centric in ways that not a lot of disciplines are. And so embrace that and be yourself and show up.
Thank you. Abby.
Yes. So when I first started working in OER, I was very confident, maybe too confident, and I often sort of pushed myself and others to do more than maybe was reasonable to hope for. I think there was a big question of, well, if I can just explain well enough, then I can get these people to be on my side. But I think my big lesson learned over time has been, don't try to build believers out of people who hate what you do. Sort of start with where it's easy, support the people who support you, and as you work with them more, you'll find more supporters along the way. Because a lot of the time, you're not going to change people's minds if they don't believe in the idea of OER. They think students are just selfish and spending money on iPhones, whatever the case may be. But when you're talking to people who honestly care and they spend time with other people who want to do interesting things in their teaching and try new things, then you're going to build more and more in a snowball effect of supporters and people interested in at least exploring open education. So not pushing when you don't need to, but going where that easy stream is a big lesson learned for me. And I have in the chat, Marco Seferel Valencia has a great chapter on building familiarity with OER that talks a little bit about identifying those audiences on your campus and finding the champions who are already there to support you.
Thank you. It is time to wrap up. I want to share my screen just briefly to let folks know what to look for, what's coming next. So we will be sending out a webinar follow-up email. We will share the webinar recording and related materials. In fact, we anticipated the chat would be interesting, so we are planning to save that and share that as well. For those who may be interested in continuing this conversation, we'll talk about future webinars and topics. But we also have an invitation for folks who might like to meet with a member of the Pressbooks team to explore the maturity model in more of a one-on-one discussion and kind of ask questions and identify resources that may be helpful with where you are. We extend that opportunity and we'll share more about how to do that in the follow-up materials. And then we have another webinar coming up on a month from today, March 7th, on cost savings and beyond, demonstrating impact and effectiveness with open education. So that'll be happening during Open Ed Week. So if that sounds interesting, we'd love to see you again. So thank you so much for our wonderful panelists. Thank you for being a lively and engaged audience. We appreciate you joining us. On behalf of Pressbooks, we're excited to continue supporting you and coming together to do this work and figure out how to get there together. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks again.